After 14 years as a pediatric nurse, Joanne Williams thought she'd seen every kind of hurt a child could endure. She'd held trembling hands through midnight fevers, whispered comfort to frightened faces, and fought alongside parents when the world seemed to crumble around their little ones. But nothing prepared her for the moment she walked into her own kitchen and saw the angry red welts wrapped around her 8-year-old daughter's arms like silent accusations. Amara sat at their small breakfast table, picking at her cereal, shoulders hunched in a way that made Joanne's chest tighten. The bright, chattering girl who usually greeted her after long hospital shifts had vanished, replaced by this quiet shadow who wouldn't meet her eyes. When Joanne gently lifted her daughter's sleeve, the marks told a story that would shatter everything she believed about safety, trust, and the institutions meant to protect children. What happens when a mother's worst nightmare isn't a stranger? In the dark, but the very place she sends her child every day. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window of their modest 2-bedroom apartment, casting familiar shadows across walls that held 8 years of memories. Joanne Williams had chosen this place deliberately, close enough to Lincoln Elementary that Amara could walk to school, far enough from the hospital that the sound of sirens wouldn't pierce their sleep. The refrigerator hummed its steady rhythm, decorated with Amara's artwork and honor roll certificates, a testament to a bright child thriving despite the challenges of single motherhood. Joanne's hands trembled as she set down her coffee mug, the ceramic clinking against the wooden table with more force than she intended. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden quiet that had settled between them, like an unwelcome guest. Amara's cereal bowl sat half empty, the milk growing warm as her daughter continued to push the colorful loops around with mechanical precision. "Baby girl," Joanne said softly, settling into the chair beside her daughter. The endearment came, naturally, born from years of bedtime stories and scraped-knee comfort. But today, it carried a weight that made her voice catch. "Can you tell Mama what happened to your arms?" Amara's spoon clinked against the bowl's edge. Her small fingers, usually animated with gestures and expressions, remained still. She was wearing one of her favorite shirts, a purple top with a glittery unicorn that Joanne had bought for her 7th birthday. The sleeves now seemed like barriers, hiding secrets that no 8-year-old should have to carry. "Nothing happened," Amara whispered, her voice barely audible above the apartment's morning sounds. The words felt rehearsed, practiced in the way that only came from repetition. Joanne had spent enough time in pediatric wards to recognize the signs. The way Amara's shoulders curved inward, as if trying to make herself smaller. The careful stillness that children adopted when they'd learned that moving too quickly might invite attention they didn't want. The hollow quality in her voice that spoke of trust broken and rebuilt in shadows. She reached across the small space between them, her fingers gentle as they touched Amara's forearm through the fabric. Even through the cotton, she could feel the slight swelling, the raised skin that told a story her daughter wasn't ready to share. "Can I see?" Joanne asked, her nurse's training warring with her mother's heart. She needed to assess the extent of the injuries, but she also needed to preserve whatever fragile trust remained between them. Amara shook her head, dark curls bouncing with the movement. Her hair was thick like her father's had been, inherited genetics that Joanne both treasured and mourned. Marcus had been gone for 3 years now, taken by a heart attack at 32 that left no time for goodbyes or explanations. Some nights, Joanne still reached across the bed expecting to find his steady presence, still caught herself saving funny stories to share with him when he got home from work. "Sweetheart, I'm not angry with you," Joanne continued, her voice steady despite the storm building in her chest. "But I need to make sure you're okay. That's my job as your mama, and it's also my job as a nurse. These marks look like they hurt, and the key understatement felt inadequate. The welts she'd glimpsed were angry and deliberate, forming patterns that suggested intentional contact rather than accidental injury. In her years at Children's Memorial, she'd documented similar marks in case files that later became evidence in family court. The thought that such evidence might now exist on her own child's body made her stomach clench. Amara finally looked up, her dark eyes wide and frightened in a way that made Joanne's breath catch. These were the same eyes that had sparkled with delight over birthday candles, that had watched Disney movies with rapt attention, that had looked at Joanne with absolute trust every morning as she prepared for school. "Mrs. Peterson said not to tell," Amara said, her voice breaking on the words. The name hit Joanne like a physical blow. Mrs. Peterson, Margaret Peterson, had taught third grade at Lincoln Elementary for 15 years. She was the teacher parents requested, the one with classroom decorations that changed with the seasons and handwritten notes of encouragement on every assignment. Joanne had met her during the parent-teacher conference in September, had shaken her hand and thanked her. "For taking such good care of Amara, Mrs. Peterson told you not to tell about what happened to your arms," Joanne asked, her training helping her keep her voice level, even as her mind raced through implications and possibilities. Amara nodded, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. She said it was a classroom management technique and that parents wouldn't understand. She said if I told, I might get in more trouble, and other kids might think I was a tattletale. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of understanding through Joanne's consciousness. Classroom management. The clinical term felt obscene when applied to the injuries she'd seen on her daughter's skin. Her hands clenched, involuntarily, nails biting into her palms as she fought to maintain the calm demeanor that Amara needed from her. "Baby, can you show me your arms now?" she asked again. "I promise I won't be upset with you. Whatever happened, it's not your fault." With movements that spoke of reluctance and shame, Amara slowly pushed up her sleeves. The full extent of the damage revealed itself in the morning light, long red welts that wrapped around both forearms, some fresh and raised, others beginning to fade into yellowish bruises. The pattern was unmistakable, ruler marks. Someone had used a wooden ruler to strike her daughter repeatedly, with enough force to leave lasting evidence. Joanne's breath caught in her throat. She'd seen similar injuries in her work, usually accompanied by caseworker visits and police reports, but those had always been other people's children, other families' tragedies that she could document with professional detachment and hand over to appropriate authorities. The clinical objectivity she'd cultivated over years of practice crumbled when faced with harm inflicted on her own child. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, gently touching the edge of one mark with her fingertip. The skin was warm and slightly swollen, indicating the injuries were recent. "When did this happen?" "Yesterday," Amara said through her tears, "and the day before, and last week too." The timeline stretched backward, suggesting a pattern rather than a single incident. Joanne's mind automatically catalogued the implications: repeated abuse, systematic targeting, premeditation. These weren't the result of a teacher losing her temper in a moment of frustration. They were evidence of deliberate, ongoing violence against a child who trusted the adult wielding the weapon. "What did you do that made Mrs. Peterson think this was necessary?" Joanne asked, immediately regretting the phrasing. She didn't want Amara to think there was any justification for what had been done to her, but she needed to understand the context. "I was talking to Sarah during math time," Amara said, her voice small and ashamed. "Mrs. Peterson said I was being disruptive, and that disruptive behavior needed consequences. She made me come to her desk and hold out my arms. She said it would help me remember to be quiet next time. The explanation felt simultaneously mundane and horrific. Talking during class, a behavior exhibited by nearly every 8-year-old in the history of education, had been met with physical violence that would be considered assault if inflicted by anyone other than a teacher. The power dynamic made it even more disturbing. A trusted authority figure using pain as a teaching tool, then manipulating the victim into silence. Joanne pulled her daughter close, feeling the small body tremble against her chest. Amara smelled like strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence, scents that seemed incompatible with the evidence of violence wrapped around her arms. For 8 years, Joanne had protected this child from harm, had navigated single motherhood with fierce determination, had built a safe harbor in a world that could be cruel and unpredictable. The knowledge that danger had found Amara in the place she was supposed to be safest felt like a betrayal of everything Joanne had worked to create. "You're not in trouble," she said firmly, her lips pressed against Amara's hair. "You didn't do anything wrong. What Mrs. Peterson did to you is wrong, and it's not your fault." "But she said—" "She lied," Joanne interrupted, the word carrying more force than she'd intended. "Adults who hurt children often tell them to keep secrets, but this isn't the kind of secret you have to keep. This is the kind of secret that grown-ups need to know about so they can make sure it never happens again." Amara pulled back to look at her mother's face, searching for reassurance in familiar features. Joanne had her father's strong jawline and her grandmother's warm brown eyes, features that had weathered the challenges of the past 3 years with grace and determination. Today, those same features were set with a resolve that Amara had never seen before. "What are you going to do?" Amara asked. The question hung between them, loaded with implications and possibilities that would reshape their lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Joanne thought of Mrs. Peterson's smile during their parent conference, of the classroom decorations and positive reputation, of the systems and institutions that had failed to protect her daughter. She thought of the other children in that classroom, of the possibility that Amara wasn't the only victim, of the pattern of behavior that might stretch back years. "I'm going to make sure you're safe," Joanne said, the words carrying the weight of a promise that would soon become a battle cry. "And I'm going to make sure this never happens to you or any other child again." She stood from the table, her mind already shifting into the systematic thinking that had served her well in medical emergencies. There would be documentation to gather, calls to make, systems to navigate. But first, there was her daughter's immediate well-being to consider. "We're going to take some pictures of your arms," she said gently, "and then we're going to call the doctor to make sure you don't need any medicine for those marks. After that, we're going to talk to some people who can help us make sure Mrs. Peterson can't hurt you anymore." Amara nodded, the trust in her eyes beginning to return. It was fragile and conditional, but it was there, a foundation upon which Joanne could begin to rebuild the safety that had been shattered. As she reached for her phone to begin documenting the evidence, she felt the familiar sensation of stepping into a crisis. But this wasn't someone else's emergency anymore. This was her fight, her child, her battle against a system that had failed them both. The fluorescent lights of the pediatric ward hummed their familiar tune as Joanne documented Amara's injuries with the same clinical precision she'd applied to countless other cases. But her hands shook as she held the camera, each photograph feeling like both evidence and indictment of her failure to protect her own child. The injuries looked even more stark under the examination room's harsh lighting, deliberate patterns that spoke of calculated punishment rather than momentary loss of control. Dr. Sarah Martinez, Amara's pediatrician since birth, examined the welts with gentle expertise. Her dark hair was pulled back in the same practical ponytail she'd worn for years, but her expression carried a gravity that Joanne had rarely seen. They'd known each other professionally for over a decade, sharing cases and consulting on difficult diagnoses, But today their relationship had shifted into something more personal and painful. "These are definitely ruler marks," Dr. Martinez said quietly, her voice pitched low so Amara couldn't hear from where she sat coloring in the corner chair. "The spacing is consistent with a standard classroom ruler, and the force required to leave these impressions suggests deliberate intent rather than accidental contact." Joanne nodded, her nurse's training allowing her to compartmentalize the clinical assessment even as her heart raged against the implications. "Multiple incidents over at least a week, possibly longer. Some are healing while others are fresh. I'll need to make a report to Child Protective Services," Dr. Martinez said, her words carrying the weight of legal obligation. "This constitutes suspected child abuse by a person in a position of trust. The school district will also need to be notified immediately." The mention of CPS sent a chill through Joanne's spine. She'd worked with their caseworkers countless times, had seen families navigate their investigations with varying degrees of success. The irony of potentially becoming the subject of their scrutiny, even as the protective parent, felt surreal and frightening. "What happens next?" Joanne asked, though her professional experience had already provided most of the answers. "CPS will likely want to interview Amara today or tomorrow. They'll also need statements from you and will probably want to photograph the injuries themselves. The school principal will need to be contacted, and there may be police involvement, depending on how the district chooses to handle it." Amara looked up from her coloring book, sensing the serious tone of the adult conversation, even if she couldn't make out the specific words. Her picture showed a house with a large tree and two stick figures holding hands, a mother and daughter standing in bright sunshine that felt heartbreakingly optimistic given their current circumstances. "Mama, are we in trouble?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Joanne knelt beside her daughter's chair, taking the crayon-stained hands in her own. "No, baby girl, we are not in trouble, but we need to talk to some people who help keep children safe. They're going to ask you questions about what happened at school, and it's important that you tell them the truth, just like you told me." "Will Mrs. Peterson be angry with me?" The question pierced Joanne's heart with its innocent concern for the very person who had harmed her. It spoke to the confused loyalty that children often felt toward authority figures, even those who hurt them. The psychological manipulation that accompanied the physical abuse was perhaps even more damaging than the welts themselves. "Mrs. Peterson's feelings are not your responsibility," Joanne said firmly. "Your only job is to tell the truth and let the grown-ups handle the rest." Dr. Martinez finished her examination and documentation, her movements efficient and professional. Despite the emotional weight of the situation, she'd been the bearer of difficult news before, diagnoses that changed families forever, prognoses that shattered carefully constructed hopes. But this felt different, more personal because of her long relationship with both mother and daughter. "I'm going to prescribe a topical antibiotic cream to prevent infection," she said, returning to the examination table where Joanne now sat. "The marks should heal completely within 2 weeks, though there may be some temporary discoloration. More importantly, I want to schedule a follow-up appointment to assess any psychological impact." The clinical language couldn't mask the reality of what they were discussing, the potential long-term effects of betrayed trust and institutional violence on an 8-year-old's developing psyche. Joanne had seen children recover from physical injuries that would make adults weep, but the wounds that cut deepest were often invisible, carried in the careful way children learned to navigate relationships when trust had been broken. "I need to call the school," Joanne said, reaching for her phone with hands that no longer trembled. The initial shock was giving way to something harder and more focused, the controlled anger that had served her well during medical crises. Principal Janet Morrison answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the harried efficiency of someone managing multiple crises simultaneously. Lincoln Elementary was a well-regarded school in their district, known for its inclusive programs and dedicated teaching staff. The contrast between its reputation and the reality of what had happened in Mrs. Peterson's classroom felt jarring and surreal. "Mrs. Williams, how can I help you today?" "Principal Morrison, this is Joanne Williams, Amara's mother. I need to schedule an immediate meeting to discuss a serious situation involving Mrs. Peterson's classroom management techniques." The pause on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Joanne to hear the background sounds of school. Life. Children's laughter, the squeak of sneakers on linoleum, the distant sound of a bell, signaling the end of recess. Normal sounds of childhood that now felt tainted by the knowledge of what had been happening behind closed classroom doors. "Mrs. Williams, I'm not sure I understand. Has there been some kind of misunderstanding with Mrs. Peterson? She's one of our most experienced teachers, and we've never had any complaints. There's been no misunderstanding," Joanne interrupted, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of delivering difficult news to anxious families. "My daughter has visible injuries on both arms that are consistent with being struck repeatedly with a ruler. She's told me that Mrs. Peterson inflicted these injuries as punishment for talking during class, and that she was instructed not to tell anyone about it." The silence that followed was profound and telling. Joanne could almost hear the gears shifting as Principal Morrison processed the implications, the potential liability, the media attention, the disruption to carefully maintained institutional reputation. The pause stretched long enough for Joanne to wonder if the call had been disconnected. "Mrs. Williams, these are very serious allegations. I think we should meet immediately to discuss this situation. Can you come in this afternoon?" "We'll be there at 2 o'clock, Joanne said, not bothering to check her schedule. Everything else in her life had suddenly become secondary to this moment of reckoning. "And Principal Morrison, my daughter will not be returning to Mrs. Peterson's classroom under any circumstances. I trust you'll make appropriate arrangements." After ending the call, Joanne sat in the examination room's sterile quiet, holding Amara's hand, while Dr. Martinez completed her paperwork. The familiar sounds of the pediatric ward continued around them. Monitor beeps, soft conversations, the occasional cry of a distressed child. These were sounds that usually brought her comfort, reminders of work that mattered and lives that could be healed. Today they felt like echoes of a world that had suddenly become less safe and predictable. "Mama?" Amara's voice was small and uncertain. "Are you going to lose your job because of me?" The question revealed the depth of her daughter's anxiety, the weight of responsibility that no child should have to carry. It also demonstrated how Mrs. Peterson's manipulation had extended beyond simple threats. She had somehow convinced Amara that seeking help would bring consequences that extended far beyond the classroom. "Absolutely not," Joanne said, squeezing her daughter's hand with gentle firmness. "I'm proud of you for telling me the truth. That took courage, and courage is something we always support in this family." As they prepared to leave the doctor's office, Joanne felt the familiar shift that occurred when moving from assessment to action. The shock and disbelief were giving way to something more purposeful, a determination that had carried her through Marcus's death, through the challenges of single parenthood, through the countless small crises that shaped their daily lives. The battle for her daughter's justice was about to begin, and Joanne Williams had never been one to back down from a fight that mattered. The Lincoln Elementary School office felt smaller than Joanne remembered from her previous visits. The cheerful bulletin boards displaying student artwork and achievement. Certificates now seemed like theatrical props masking a darker reality. She sat in the same chair where she'd once discussed Amara's academic progress and social development. But today the conversation would be about institutional failure and child abuse. Principal Morrison entered with measured steps, her professional, smile strained at the edges. She was a woman in her late 50s who dedicated 30 years to education, rising through the ranks with a reputation for fairness and innovation. Her grey hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore the kind of practical blazer that suggested competence without ostentation. But today, her usual confidence seemed shaken. "Mrs. Williams, thank you for coming in so quickly," she said, settling behind her desk with careful precision. "I want you to know that we take any concerns about our students' welfare very seriously." Joanne had brought a manila folder containing Dr. Martinez's photographs and medical report, along with her own detailed notes about Amara's disclosure. The documentation felt both protective and accusatory, evidence that would either prompt appropriate action or serve as ammunition in a longer battle. "I've prepared a complete account of what my daughter told me, along with medical documentation of her injuries," Joanne said, placing the folder on the desk between them. "I think you should review this before we discuss next steps." Principal Morrison opened the folder with the cautious movements of someone expecting to find something unpleasant. Her expression shifted as she examined the photographs, from professional skepticism to genuine shock, then to something that looked like personal pain. These weren't abstract allegations anymore. They were documented evidence of harm inflicted on a child in her building. "My God," she whispered, her administrator's composure cracking slightly. "I had no idea. Mrs. Peterson has never had any complaints filed against her. She's been Teacher of the Year twice in the past 5 years. With respect, Principal Morrison, the fact that no complaints have been filed doesn't mean no harm has been done," Joanne replied, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "My daughter was specifically told not to tell anyone about these incidents. How many other children might have received similar instructions?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Both women understood the implications. If this was a pattern of behavior, there could be other victims who had been successfully silenced. The thought of multiple children suffering in scared isolation made Joanne's stomach clench with renewed fury. "I need to speak with Mrs. Peterson immediately," Principal Morrison said, reaching for her phone. "And I'll need to interview the other students in her class to determine if there have been any other incidents. Mrs. Peterson cannot have access to any children until this investigation is complete," Joanne said firmly. "My daughter will not be returning to her classroom, and I strongly suggest that no other child should be placed in her care until this matter is resolved." Principal Morrison paused, her hand hovering over the phone. The administrative implications were enormous. Removing a teacher mid-semester would require substitute arrangements, parent notifications, and careful management of school district policies. But the legal and moral implications of inaction were even greater. "You're right, of course," she said after a moment. "I'll need to contact the superintendent and the district's legal counsel. Mrs. Peterson will be placed on administrative leave. Pending investigation." The words felt like a small victory, but Joanne knew this was only the beginning. Institutional change moved slowly, often prioritizing reputation management over accountability. The real test would come in the weeks ahead, when media attention waned and the pressure to return to normal operations increased. "What about the other children in her class?" Joanne asked. "They'll need counseling support, and their parents deserve to know what's been happening." "We have protocols for these situations," Principal Morrison said, though her tone suggested she'd never expected to implement them. "The district's crisis counselors will be brought in, and we'll send a letter to all families in Mrs. Peterson's class, informing them of the situation and providing resources for support." Joanne thought about the other parents, working mothers and fathers who sent their children to school each morning with the same trust she'd once felt. They would read that letter with the same shock and horror she'd experienced just hours earlier, followed by the same desperate need to protect and the same fury at institutional failure. "I want to be clear about something," Joanne said, leaning forward slightly. "This isn't about vengeance or publicity. This is about ensuring that no child ever experiences what my daughter has endured. If I discover that this school or this district has been aware of problems with Mrs. Peterson and failed to act, I will hold every responsible party accountable." The threat was delivered in the same calm tone Joanne used when explaining complex medical procedures to anxious families, but its impact was unmistakable. Principal Morrison understood that she was dealing with someone who possessed both the knowledge to navigate institutional systems and the determination to use that knowledge relentlessly. "Mrs. Williams, I want to assure you that we will conduct a thorough investigation. The district will cooperate fully with any law enforcement or social services inquiries, and we'll implement whatever changes are necessary to prevent future incidents." "Changes like what?" Joanne pressed. "Surveillance in classrooms, training programs on appropriate disciplinary measures, regular psychological evaluations for staff members who work with children." Each suggestion carried implications that extended far beyond Mrs. Peterson's individual case. They spoke to systemic issues within educational institutions, the isolation that allowed abuse to flourish, the authority structures that discouraged reporting, the inadequate oversight that failed to protect vulnerable children. Principal Morrison made notes as Joanne spoke, her pen moving quickly across a yellow legal pad. The list of potential reforms grew longer with each suggestion, representing the kind of comprehensive changes that would require district-level approval and significant resource allocation. "I also want assurance that Amara will be placed with a teacher who understands trauma-informed education practices," Joanne continued. "She's going to need time to rebuild trust in adult authority figures, and that requires someone with specific training and sensitivity. Of course, Mrs. Rodriguez has extensive experience with students who've experienced trauma, and she has an opening in her third-grade class. I think it would be an excellent fit for Amara." The mention of Mrs. Rodriguez brought a small measure of relief. Joanne had heard positive things about her from other parents, stories of patience, creativity, and genuine care for each child's individual needs. It wouldn't erase what had happened, but it offered hope for healing and forward progress. As the meeting concluded, Joanne gathered her documentation with the satisfied feeling of someone who had successfully navigated the first phase of a complex challenge. But she also understood that this was just the beginning. The real work would come in the days and weeks ahead, as investigations proceeded and institutional responses were tested. Walking through the school hallways toward the exit, she passed bulletin boards celebrating academic achievements and upcoming events, the ordinary markers of educational life that continued despite the crisis unfolding behind administrative doors. Children's laughter echoed from nearby classrooms, a sound that should have brought comfort, but now carried undertones of vulnerability and misplaced trust. The battle for her daughter's justice had been joined, and Joanne Williams was prepared for whatever came next. The Child Protective Services office occupied a nondescript building that looked more like an insurance company than the epicenter of family crisis intervention. Joanne had visited similar facilities in her professional capacity, accompanying young patients whose home situations required investigation. Today, she sat in the waiting area holding Amara's hand, experiencing the anxiety that usually belonged to other families. Ms. Patricia Chen emerged from the interview rooms with the measured pace of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. She was younger than Joanne had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with kind eyes that suggested genuine concern beneath professional necessity. Her credentials included a master's degree in social work and specialized training in child trauma, qualifications that offered some reassurance in an inherently unsettling process. "Mrs. Williams, I'm Patricia Chen from CPS," she said, extending her hand with a firm grip that conveyed competence. I understand you have some concerns about your daughter's treatment at school. The understatement felt jarring, but Joanne recognized the careful language that social workers used when beginning investigations. Every word would potentially become part of an official record, requiring precision and objectivity, even when discussing situations that demanded emotional response. My daughter was physically abused by her teacher over multiple incidents, Joanne corrected, her voice carrying the authority that came from medical training and maternal certainty. I have photographic documentation and medical reports confirming the abuse. Ms. Chen nodded, making notes on a tablet that she held with practiced efficiency. I'll need to interview Amara privately, as well as review all documentation you've gathered. The process may take several hours, and I want to prepare you both for what to expect. Amara pressed closer to her mother's side, her small body radiating the anxiety that children felt when thrust into adult systems they didn't understand. She wore her favorite dress, purple with small flowers, that usually made her feel grown up and confident. Today, it seemed like armor against unfamiliar territory. Will I get in trouble for telling? Amara asked, echoing the fear that Mrs. Peterson had deliberately cultivated. Absolutely not, Ms. Chen said, crouching down to Amara's eye level with the natural ease of someone comfortable with children. My job is to make sure kids are safe. When grown-ups hurt children, it's never the child's fault, and children should never be punished for asking for help. The simple explanation seemed to ease some of Amara's tension, though her grip on Joanne's hand remained firm. They'd discussed what to expect during the drive over, but intellectual preparation couldn't fully address the emotional reality of institutional scrutiny. I want to observe the interview, Joanne said, knowing the request would likely be denied, but needing to advocate for her daughter's comfort. I understand your concern, but private interviews allow children to speak more freely about difficult experiences, Ms. Chen replied with practiced diplomacy. However, we can arrange for you to watch through a one-way window if that would help ease your anxiety. The compromise felt inadequate, but necessary. Joanne had learned over the years that working within institutional systems required strategic flexibility, choosing which battles to fight and when to accept partial victories in service of larger goals. The interview room was designed to be child-friendly, with bright colors and age-appropriate furniture that seemed almost absurdly cheerful. Given its purpose, toys and art supplies occupied one corner, while a small table held juice boxes and crackers that most children were too nervous to consume. Through the one-way window, Joanne watched her daughter settle into a chair that made her look even smaller than usual. Ms. Chen's questioning technique demonstrated professional skill and genuine sensitivity. She began with neutral topics, Amara's favorite subjects in school, her friends, her hobbies, building rapport before gradually approaching more difficult territory. The process felt both necessary and painful, watching her daughter navigate questions that no child should have to answer. Can you tell me about your teacher, Mrs. Peterson? Ms. Chen asked, her voice maintaining the same gentle tone she'd used when discussing favorite colors and pets. Amara's posture changed subtly, shoulders curving inward in the protective stance that Joanne had noticed that morning at breakfast. She's nice sometimes, but sometimes she gets angry. What happens when she gets angry? She makes kids come to her desk and hold out their arms, then she hits them with the ruler. The words came out in a rush, as if Amara was afraid she might lose courage if she spoke more slowly. Did this happen to you? Amara nodded, tears beginning to form in her dark eyes. I was talking to Sarah about the math problem. I didn't understand it and Sarah was helping me, but Mrs. Peterson said I was being disruptive. Through the glass, Joanne watched her daughter relive the trauma, each word feeling like a fresh injury to her own heart. The clinical objectivity required for proper documentation warred with maternal instincts that demanded immediate comfort and protection. Did Mrs. Peterson say anything when she used the ruler? Ms. Chen continued, her questions following protocols designed to gather legally admissible evidence while minimizing additional trauma to the child. She said it would help me remember to follow classroom rules, and she said not to tell anyone. Because parents wouldn't understand that teachers sometimes have to use strong discipline. The manipulation embedded in Mrs. Peterson's words became even more clear in Amara's innocent retelling. The teacher had carefully constructed justifications that isolated her victims and protected her actions from scrutiny. It was a pattern that suggested experience and premeditation rather than momentary lapses in judgment. Ms. Chen spent another 30 minutes gathering details, dates, frequency, the presence of other witnesses, the specific language used by Mrs. Peterson. Each question built a more complete picture of systematic abuse disguised as educational discipline. By the end of the interview, Joanne had witnessed her daughter demonstrate remarkable courage in recounting experiences that would challenge many adults. Amara showed exceptional bravery today, Ms. Chen said when they reconvened in her office. Her account was consistent and detailed, which will be important as we move forward with the investigation. What are the next steps? Joanne asked. Though her professional experience had already provided most of the answers, I'll be coordinating with local law enforcement to determine if criminal charges are appropriate. The school district's investigation will proceed in parallel, though they'll need to wait for our findings before taking final action. I'll also be contacting other families to determine if there are additional victims. The mention of other families sent a chill through Joanne's chest. She thought of the children in Mrs. Peterson's classroom, of parents who might discover similar injuries when they looked more carefully, of the possibility that Amara's disclosure could reveal a much larger pattern of abuse. How long does the investigation typically take? She asked. These cases can take several months to resolve completely, depending on the complexity and the number of victims involved. But I want to assure you that Amara's immediate safety is our priority, and the school has already taken appropriate steps to ensure she won't have further contact with Mrs. Peterson. As they prepared to leave, Joanne felt the weight of entering, a process that would extend far beyond their family's individual trauma. They were now part of a larger system of investigation, documentation, and potential prosecution that would unfold according to institutional timelines rather than personal healing needs. But they had also taken the crucial first step toward justice, and Joanne Williams had never been one to retreat once a righteous fight had begun. The first crack in the district's unified response came through an unexpected phone call 2 days after the CPS interview. Detective Maria Santos from the county's Special Victims Unit introduced herself with the weary professionalism of someone who had seen too many cases like this one. Her voice carried the slight rasp of a longtime smoker trying to quit, and she spoke with the careful precision of someone accustomed to giving testimony in courtrooms. Mrs. Williams, I've reviewed the CPS report and Dr. Martinez's medical documentation, she said without preamble. I need to inform you that we've received additional reports about Mrs. Peterson from other families. This investigation has expanded beyond your daughter's case. Joanne felt her breath catch, though she'd anticipated this possibility since Ms. Chen had mentioned contacting other parents. The confirmation that Amara wasn't alone brought both relief and renewed outrage. Relief that her daughter's account was being corroborated, outrage that other children had suffered in silence. How many other children? She asked, settling into the kitchen chair where this nightmare had begun just days earlier. I can't discuss specific details due to ongoing investigation protocols, but I can tell you that we're looking at a pattern of behavior that may extend back several years. Some parents found injuries when they started looking more carefully after receiving the district's letter. The implications were staggering. If Mrs. Peterson had been systematically abusing children for years, it suggested institutional failure on multiple levels, inadequate supervision, ignored warning signs, and a culture that prioritized reputation over child safety. Joanne thought of the Teacher of the Year awards, the glowing parent recommendations, the administrative praise that had masked ongoing violence. "What does this mean for the criminal case?" she asked. "Multiple victims strengthen the prosecution's position significantly. It establishes a pattern of deliberate behavior rather than isolated incidents. However, it also means the investigation will take longer and involve more complex coordination between agencies." Detective Santos explained that she would need to interview Amara again, this time with the video recording equipment required for potential courtroom testimony. The prospect of putting her 8-year-old daughter through additional questioning felt daunting, but Joanne understood the necessity. Justice required documentation that could withstand legal scrutiny. "I also need to prepare you for the possibility of media attention," Detective Santos continued. "Cases involving educators often draw public interest, especially when multiple victims are involved. The district's public relations team is already working to manage the story." The mention of public relations strategy made Joanne's jaw clench. While she and other families were dealing with traumatized children and seeking justice, the school district was apparently focused on damage control and reputation management. The contrast in priorities felt both predictable and infuriating. That afternoon brought another unexpected development. Joanne answered her phone to find herself speaking with Janet Morrison, but this time the principal's tone carried an edge of defensiveness that hadn't been present during their face-to-face meeting. "Mrs. Williams, I need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your daughter's account of events," Principal Morrison said, her words carefully chosen and delivered with administrative formality. "What kind of concerns?" Joanne asked, though she could already sense the direction of the conversation. "Mrs. Peterson's union representative has retained legal counsel, and they're questioning some of the details in Amara's statement to CPS. They've also noted that your daughter had some behavioral incidents earlier in the semester that may be relevant to understanding the context of any disciplinary actions." The implication was clear. The school district was preparing to shift blame onto an 8-year-old victim, painting her as a problematic child whose behavior had somehow justified physical violence. Joanne felt her professional composure beginning to crack as maternal fury took precedence. "Principal Morrison, are you seriously suggesting that my daughter's behavior warranted being beaten with a ruler? That an 8-year-old talking during math class deserved to be physically assaulted by a trusted adult?" "No, of course not," Principal Morrison said quickly, backtracking from the implications of her previous statement. "I'm simply informing you that Mrs. Peterson's legal team is building a defense, and they may try to present your daughter's classroom behavior as relevant context." "Then let me provide some context of my own," Joanne said, her voice gaining the steel that colleagues recognized when she was advocating for a patient's care. "My daughter is a straight-A student with no history of violence or serious disciplinary problems. She's been on the honor roll every semester since starting school. If Mrs. Peterson found her behavior challenging, the appropriate response was to contact me for a parent conference, not to physically assault her." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Principal Morrison attempting to maintain diplomatic neutrality while clearly positioning the district to minimize liability. Joanne recognized the institutional dance, the careful language, designed to avoid admission of fault while appearing cooperative with investigations. After hanging up, she sat in her quiet apartment, trying to process the day's developments. The case was expanding beyond her individual family's trauma into something larger and more complex. Other children, other families, other parents who were probably experiencing the same mixture of shock, anger, and determination that had consumed her life for the past week. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Hi, this is Karen Martinez. My son David is in Mrs. Peterson's class. Can we talk?" The message represented both validation and responsibility. Other parents were reaching out, seeking connection and information in the wake of the district's carefully worded notification letter. Joanne understood that she was likely to become an unofficial coordinator for families navigating this crisis, a role she hadn't sought but felt obligated to accept. She arranged to meet Karen Martinez that evening at a coffee shop near the school. The neutral location would allow for private conversation, while avoiding the potential complications of home visits during an active investigation. As she prepared for the meeting, Joanne realized that her individual battle for Amara's justice was evolving into something much larger, a collective effort to hold institutional power accountable for its failures. The evening meeting revealed the scope of the challenge they faced. Karen Martinez was a single mother like herself, working 2 jobs to support her family while pursuing a nursing degree part-time. Her son David had mentioned being disciplined by Mrs. Peterson, but she'd assumed it referred to verbal correction or timeout procedures. The possibility that it involved physical violence hadn't occurred to her until she received the district's letter. "I found bruises on David's wrists last night," Karen said, her voice shaking with the same combination of guilt and rage that Joanne recognized from her own experience. "When I asked him about them, he said Mrs. Peterson had grabbed him too, hard, when she was helping him remember to sit still. He didn't think it was important enough to mention. The pattern was becoming clear: systematic abuse disguised as discipline, accompanied by manipulation that convinced children their suffering was both normal and deserved. The psychological damage was potentially even more harmful than the physical injuries, teaching vulnerable children that adult authority figures could hurt them with impunity." As they talked, other parents arrived at the coffee shop. Word was spreading through informal networks, school pickup conversations, neighborhood connections, social media groups. By the end of the evening, 6 families had gathered around pushed-together tables, sharing stories and planning collective action. The battle for justice had become a community effort, and Joanne Williams found herself at the center of a movement she never wanted to lead but couldn't abandon. The district's strategy became clearer during a tense meeting 3 weeks. After the initial disclosure, Superintendent Dr. Richard Hawthorne had requested a conference with all affected families, ostensibly to discuss support services and procedural updates. His office occupied the top floor of the district's administrative building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the community he'd served for 8 years. The view was impressive, but today it felt more like a throne room than a public servant's workspace. Dr. Hawthorne was a man in his early 60s who'd built his reputation on fiscal responsibility and test score improvements. His silver hair and expensive suits projected competence and authority, qualities that had served him well during budget crises and teacher contract negotiations. But today, his usual confidence seemed forced, strained by circumstances that threatened both his district's reputation and his own career trajectory. "I want to begin by expressing my sincere regret for the experiences your children have endured," he said, addressing the 7 families assembled in his conference room. "The district takes these allegations very seriously, and we're committed to ensuring that such incidents never happen again." Joanne noticed the careful word choice: allegations rather than abuse, incidents rather than crimes. The language was designed to minimize legal exposure while appearing appropriately concerned. She'd learned to recognize institutional doublespeak during her years working within hospital systems, where liability concerns often shaped communication more than truth-telling. What specific steps is the district taking to prevent future abuse? Asked Michael Torres, father of 9-year-old Sophia, who'd been in Mrs. Peterson's class the previous year. His question carried the controlled anger of someone trying to navigate bureaucracy while advocating for his child. Dr. Hawthorne gestured to a folder thick with policy documents. We're implementing comprehensive reforms to our classroom monitoring procedures, enhancing our teacher training programs, and establishing new protocols for reporting concerns about inappropriate disciplinary methods. The reforms sounded impressive in abstract, but Joanne's professional experience had taught her to look for concrete specifics behind administrative generalities. What does enhanced monitoring actually look like in practice? She asked. Are we talking about cameras in classrooms, regular administrative observations, or something else entirely? We're exploring multiple options, Dr. Hawthorne replied, his answer revealing nothing while appearing responsive. However, I need to address some concerns that have been raised about the characterization of Mrs. Peterson's classroom management techniques. The shift in tone was subtle but unmistakable. Dr. Hawthorne opened another folder, this one containing what appeared to be student disciplinary records. Joanne felt her stomach tighten as she recognized the defensive strategy taking shape. Several of the children involved in this situation had documented behavioral challenges that required additional classroom management, he continued, reading from prepared notes. Mrs. Peterson was implementing individualized behavior modification, strategies that were within accepted educational practices. Beating children with rulers is an accepted educational practice. Karen Martinez's voice rose with indignation, her usual reserve cracking under the pressure of watching her son's suffering being reframed as appropriate discipline. No one is suggesting that physical discipline is appropriate, Dr. Hawthorne said quickly, though his previous statement had implied exactly that. However, we need to understand these incidents within the context of challenging classroom dynamics and the need for effective behavior management strategies. The word incidents, again, as if systematic child abuse was merely a series of unfortunate miscommunications rather than deliberate violence. Joanne recognized the legal strategy, established doubt about the severity and intentionality of the harm, while subtly shifting responsibility onto the victims and their families. Dr. Hawthorne, she said, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of advocating for vulnerable patients. Are you suggesting that my 8-year-old daughter's occasional talking during class justified being struck hard enough to leave welts that lasted for weeks? I'm not justifying anything, he replied, though his defensive posture suggested otherwise. I'm simply ensuring that we have a complete understanding of the classroom environment and the challenges Mrs. Peterson was facing. The meeting continued for another hour, with parents asking pointed questions about oversight failures and Dr. Hawthorne providing carefully crafted responses that revealed little while appearing cooperative. It became increasingly clear that the district's primary concern was liability management rather than accountability or reform. After the meeting, the affected families gathered in the parking lot, their frustration palpable in the late afternoon air. The unity that had emerged during their coffee shop meetings was solidifying into something more organized and determined. They're going to try to paint our kids as problem children who drove a good teacher to desperate measures, said Lisa Chen, mother of 6-year-old Emma, who'd been struck for fidgeting during story time. We can't let them control the narrative. Joanne nodded, recognizing the pattern from her work with families navigating medical malpractice situations. Institutional self-protection often involved victim-blaming strategies designed to shift focus from systemic failures to individual characteristics of those who'd been harmed. "We need our own legal representation," she said, voicing what several parents were thinking. "The district's interests and our children's interests are not aligned." Michael Torres had already been researching attorneys who specialized in educational abuse cases. "I've identified 3 firms with experience in these situations. We should probably arrange consultations with all of them before deciding how to proceed." The conversation continued as children played on nearby playground equipment, their laughter creating a poignant contrast to the serious adult discussions about justice and institutional accountability. These were the same children who'd been harmed by someone they'd been taught to trust and respect, now caught in the complex machinery of legal and administrative processes they didn't understand. Amara approached her mother with a dandelion she'd picked from the school grounds, her small face bright with the innocent pleasure of a simple discovery. The gesture reminded Joanne of why this fight mattered, not for vengeance or publicity, but for the fundamental principle that children deserved protection from those entrusted with their care. "Mama, why do we have to keep talking about Mrs. Peterson?" Amara asked, her question carrying the weariness that came from being the center of adult attention for traumatic reasons. "Because sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt children, and other grown-ups need to make sure those mistakes don't happen again," Joanne explained, kneeling to accept the flower with appropriate solemnity. "Will she hurt other kids if we don't talk about it?" The question pierced straight to the heart of their collective motivation. Mrs. Peterson remained on administrative leave, but her ultimate fate would depend on the outcome of investigations that could be influenced by political pressure and public relations strategies. The possibility that she might return to a classroom filled with vulnerable children was unacceptable to every parent present. "That's what we're working to prevent," Joanne said, tucking the dandelion behind her daughter's ear with gentle care. "Sometimes protecting people requires difficult conversations and hard work." As they drove home, Joanne reflected on how much their lives had changed in just 3 weeks. What had begun as a mother's horror at discovering her child's injuries had evolved into a community effort to hold institutional power accountable for its failures. The battle was just beginning, and she understood that the road ahead would test every resource of strength and determination she possessed. But Amara's question echoed in her mind with crystalline clarity. Will she hurt other kids if we don't talk about it? The answer to that question would drive everything that came next. The revelation came through an unexpected source, Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, the night custodian at Lincoln Elementary who had worked there for 12 years. She appeared at Joanne's apartment on a rainy Thursday evening, her weathered hands clutching a manila envelope that would change everything they thought they knew about Margaret Peterson's reign of terror. "I heard about what happened to your little girl," Mrs. Vasquez said, her accented English carrying the weight of someone who had carried a burden alone for too long. "I should have spoken up years ago. I should have done something." Joanne invited her in, sensing the significance of this unexpected visit. Mrs. Vasquez was in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and the sturdy build of someone accustomed to physical labor. Her cleaning uniform bore the logo of the district's contracted custodial service, but today she seemed to be speaking as something more than an employee. "I clean the classrooms after hours," Mrs. Vasquez continued, settling nervously on the edge of Joanne's sofa. "I see things. I hear things. I've been documenting Mrs. Peterson's behavior for 3 years, but I didn't know what to do with the information." The manila envelope contained a collection that took Joanne's breath away. Photographs of damaged classroom furniture, copies of incident reports that had been filed and apparently ignored, and most damning of all, audio recordings captured on Mrs. Vasquez's personal phone during her evening cleaning shifts. "She stays late sometimes to prepare lessons," Mrs. Vasquez explained, making air quotes around the euphemism. But I've heard her practicing what she says to children. She rehearses the words she uses to make them stay quiet about the discipline. She's been doing this for a very long time. Joanne's hands trembled as she examined photographs showing broken rulers, damaged desks with what appeared to be impact marks, and a classroom supply closet that had been converted into what Mrs. Vasquez called the discipline area. The images painted a picture of systematic preparation for child abuse, not impulsive acts of frustration, but calculated violence carried out with methodical precision. "Why didn't you report this before?" Joanne asked, though she already suspected. The answer involved the complex power dynamics that protected institutional abusers. "I tried once, 2 years ago," Mrs. Vasquez said, shame evident in her voice. "I went to Principal Morrison with some of the photographs. She said Mrs. Peterson was dealing with challenging students, and that classroom management sometimes required firm discipline. She told me to focus on my cleaning duties and let the teachers handle education. The revelation recontextualized everything they thought they knew about the administration's knowledge and complicity." Principal Morrison's shocked reaction during their initial meeting had been performance art, designed to protect herself and the district from liability. She had known about Mrs. Peterson's methods and had actively chosen to ignore evidence of ongoing abuse. "There's more," Mrs. Vasquez continued, reaching into the envelope to retrieve a small digital recorder. "Last week, after the investigation started, I heard Mrs. Peterson talking to someone on the phone in her classroom. She was coaching them on what to say if anyone asked questions. The audio quality was poor, filtered through classroom walls, and captured on equipment never designed for surveillance. But Mrs. Peterson's voice was unmistakable, and her words were clear enough to understand. The conspiracy taking shape. The key is to emphasize how difficult these children were to manage," Mrs. Peterson's recorded voice explained to an unknown listener. "Document every behavioral incident, every disruption, every sign that traditional discipline methods weren't working. We need to show that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary measures." The conversation continued for several minutes, revealing a coordinated effort to build retroactive justification for years of systematic abuse. Mrs. Peterson was instructing someone, possibly other teachers or district administrators, on how to construct a defense based on victim blaming and behavioral documentation. "I also found this in her desk drawer," Mrs. Vasquez said, producing a leather-bound notebook filled with handwritten entries. "She's been keeping detailed records of every child she's disciplined, including notes about which ones are most likely to tell their parents and which ones can be trusted to stay quiet." The notebook was a predator's handbook, filled with psychological profiles that demonstrated Mrs. Peterson's calculated approach to selecting and silencing victims. Some entries made Joanne's stomach turn with their clinical detachment. Amara Williams, strong family support, likely to report, use authority dynamic and shame to ensure compliance. Other entries revealed the scope of the abuse, dozens of children over multiple years, with detailed notes about their vulnerabilities, family situations, and likelihood of disclosure. Mrs. Peterson had been operating like a methodical predator, carefully choosing victims while building institutional protection for her actions. "This changes everything," Joanne said, her mind racing through the implications. The evidence didn't just prove Mrs. Peterson's guilt, it revealed a conspiracy involving school administration and potentially other staff members. The cover-up was as damaging as the original abuse, demonstrating institutional corruption at multiple levels. "I'm scared they'll fire me for speaking up," Mrs. Vasquez admitted, voicing the fear that had kept her silent for years. "I need this job to support my family, but I can't stay quiet anymore after seeing what happened to your daughter and the other children." Joanne reached across to squeeze the older woman's hand, recognizing the courage it had taken to come forward, despite legitimate fears about retaliation. Mrs. Vasquez was risking her livelihood to protect children she didn't even know, motivated by the same moral clarity that had driven Joanne's own battle for justice. "We'll make sure you're protected," Joanne promised, though she wasn't entirely certain how such protection could be guaranteed. Whistleblower laws existed, but they were often inadequate against the subtle retaliation that institutions could deploy against inconvenient truth-tellers. The evidence Mrs. Vasquez had gathered would need to be turned over to Detective Santos immediately, but Joanne understood that it also represented a strategic advantage in their battle against district stonewalling. The administration could no longer claim ignorance or position Mrs. Peterson as a dedicated teacher who had simply made some regrettable disciplinary choices. As Mrs. Vasquez prepared to leave, she turned back with one final revelation that sent chills through Joanne's spine. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "Mrs. Peterson isn't working alone. I've seen other teachers come to her classroom for what they call discipline consultations. She's been training them in her methods." The implications exploded through Joanne's consciousness like shockwaves. This wasn't an isolated case of one abusive teacher. It was potentially a systematic approach to child discipline that had been spreading through the school like a cancer. Other teachers, other classrooms, other children who might be suffering in silence while their abusers coordinated their defense strategies. "Which teachers?" Joanne asked, though she dreaded the answer. "I have photographs of them entering and leaving her classroom during planning periods," Mrs. Vasquez said, patting the manila envelope. "Everything is documented. I may just be a custodian, but I know wrong when I see it, and I've been seeing it for far too long." After Mrs. Vasquez left, Joanne sat in her quiet apartment holding evidence that would reshape their entire understanding of the case. What had begun as a mother's fight to protect her daughter had revealed institutional corruption that potentially affected dozens of children and families. The battle ahead would be larger and more complex than anything she had imagined, but the evidence Mrs. Vasquez had provided gave them something they'd lacked before: the power to hold the entire system accountable for its failures. Tomorrow, Detective Santos would receive documentation that could transform a criminal case against one teacher into a comprehensive investigation of institutional child abuse. Tonight, Joanne Williams prepared herself for a fight that would test every resource of strength and determination she possessed. But first, she needed to check on Amara to make sure her daughter was sleeping peacefully in the safety of their home, protected for now from the larger storm that was about to break over their community. The district attorney's office occupied a granite building that had housed the county's legal proceedings for over 50 years. Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Martinez, no relation to Dr. Martinez, though the coincidence had provided a moment of levity during their first phone conversation, specialized in cases involving crimes against children. Her reputation for tenacious prosecution and victim advocacy had made her both respected and feared within legal circles. Joanne sat across from her in a conference room lined with law books and case files. Mrs. Vasquez's evidence spread across a mahogany table that had probably witnessed thousands of similar moments when documentation became the foundation for justice. Detective Santos occupied the chair beside her, while the custodian herself sat near the window, still nervous about her decision to come forward, but resolute in her commitment to protecting children. "This changes the entire scope of the investigation," ADA Martinez said, her voice carrying the controlled excitement of a prosecutor who had just received the evidence needed to transform a difficult case into a winnable one. "What we're looking at now isn't just individual acts of abuse. It's conspiracy, institutional cover-up, and potentially racketeering if we can prove systematic coordination." The legal terminology felt both validating and overwhelming. Joanne had spent weeks fighting for recognition that her daughter had been systematically abused. No, they were discussing federal charges and institutional corruption on a scale that extended far beyond Mrs. Peterson's individual crimes. "How many other teachers are we talking about?" Detective Santos asked, reviewing the photographs Mrs. Vasquez had captured of educators entering and leaving Mrs. Peterson's classroom during planning periods. "At least 4 that I documented regularly," Mrs. Vasquez replied, her confidence growing as she realized her evidence was being taken seriously. "Maybe more. They called them classroom management seminars, but I heard enough conversations to know they were sharing discipline techniques." Ada Martinez made notes on a yellow legal pad, her pen moving with the rapid precision of someone accustomed to building complex cases from multiple evidence streams. "We'll need search warrants for the school building, particularly Mrs. Peterson's classroom and any offices where related documentation might be stored. We'll also need to expand our victim interviews to include children from the other implicated teachers' classes." The prospect of more children coming forward brought both hope and heartbreak. Hope because additional victims would strengthen the case against institutional corruption. Heartbreak because it meant more families would discover they had failed to protect their children from systematic abuse disguised as education. "What about the administrators who knew and failed to act?" Joanne asked, thinking of Principal Morrison's carefully crafted performance during their initial meeting. "Failure to report suspected child abuse is a crime in this state," Ada Martinez replied. "If we can prove that administrators received credible reports and chose not to act, they can be charged as accessories." The documentation Mrs. Vasquez provided suggests a pattern of deliberate indifference that goes beyond simple negligence. The meeting continued for 2 hours, with Ada Martinez outlining the investigation strategy that would unfold over the coming weeks. Search warrants would be executed simultaneously across multiple locations to prevent evidence tampering. Additional victims would be identified through careful review of student records and teacher assignments. The conspiracy aspect would be built through analysis of communications, scheduling patterns, and witness testimony. "I need to prepare you for the possibility of significant media attention," Ada Martinez warned as the meeting concluded. Cases involving educational institutions and multiple victims often become high-profile stories. The defense will try to use media coverage to their advantage, so we'll need to be strategic about public communications. Joanne understood the implications. Their private battle for justice was about to become a public spectacle, with reporters, cameras, and community opinions shaping the narrative around their family's trauma. The thought of Amara's story becoming fodder for news cycles and social media commentary made her stomach clench with protective anxiety. That evening, she called the other affected parents to update them on the day's developments. The conference calls stretched across 2 hours as families processed the revelation that their children's abuse was part of a much larger conspiracy. Anger mixed with validation as parents realized their instincts about institutional indifference had been correct. "They're going to come after our kids harder now," predicted Michael Torres, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent weeks fighting bureaucratic stonewalling. "If this becomes a major case, they'll try to destroy our children's credibility to protect themselves. Let them try," Karen Martinez replied, with steel in her voice. "We have evidence now, we have documentation, and we have each other." The solidarity that had emerged among the families was perhaps the one positive outcome of their shared trauma. Parents who had never met before were now united by their children's suffering and their determination to prevent future harm. They had formed a support network that would be crucial in the challenging months ahead. The next few days brought a flurry of activity that felt like preparation for war. Attorneys were retained, victim advocates were assigned, and media strategies were developed, Joanne found herself at the center of a legal and public relations campaign that extended far beyond her initial goal of protecting her daughter. She also noticed changes in Amara that both encouraged and concerned her. Her daughter was sleeping better since Mrs. Rodriguez had taken over her classroom instruction, and the nightmares that had plagued the first weeks were becoming less frequent. But there was also a hyper-vigilance that hadn't existed before, a watchful quality that spoke to innocence lost and trust that would need to be rebuilt over time. "Mama, why do so many people want to talk to me about Mrs. Peterson?" Amara asked one evening as they prepared for another interview, this one with victim advocates who would help prepare her for potential trial testimony. "Because what happened to you also happened to other children, and grown-ups need to understand how serious it was so they can make sure it never happens again," Joanne explained, using language that had become familiar over repeated conversations. "Will I have to talk to strangers about it forever?" The question pierced Joanne's heart with its weary wisdom. Her 8-year-old daughter had developed an understanding of institutional processes that no child should need to possess. She had learned that adult failures required children to repeatedly relive their trauma in service of justice that might never fully heal their wounds. "Not forever, sweetheart, but maybe for a while longer, until the judge and jury understand what happened and can make the right decisions." "What's the right decision?" Joanne paused, considering how to explain concepts of justice and accountability to someone whose understanding of fairness had been shattered by the very adults meant to protect her. "The right decision is making sure Mrs. Peterson can never hurt another child, and making sure the grown-ups who were supposed to stop her face consequences for not doing their jobs." 3 days later, the investigation exploded into public view when search warrants were executed simultaneously at Lincoln Elementary, the district administration building, and Mrs. Peterson's home. News vans lined the school parking lot as investigators carried boxes of evidence from the building where dozens of families had entrusted their children's safety to institutional care. The local news coverage was extensive but respectful, focusing on systemic failures rather than sensationalizing individual trauma. Joanne watched from her apartment as reporters interviewed parents, education experts, and legal analysts about the implications of the case. Their private nightmare had become a community reckoning with institutional trust and accountability. Principal Morrison appeared on camera outside the school building, flanked by district lawyers and looking haggard under the bright television lights. Her statement was brief and defensive. "The district is cooperating fully with law enforcement and remains committed to student safety. We cannot comment on ongoing investigations, but we maintain confidence in our educational mission and our staff's dedication to student welfare." The words felt hollow and self-serving, particularly given the evidence that administration officials had known about and ignored reports of systematic abuse. But Joanne recognized the institutional response: defend, deflect, and minimize until legal proceedings forced more concrete accountability. Mrs. Peterson herself was not available for comment, having retained criminal defense counsel who advised complete silence pending trial. But her attorney's brief statement to reporters suggested the defense strategy that was taking shape. "Mrs. Peterson is a dedicated educator with 15 years of exemplary service. We believe the evidence will show that any disciplinary actions she took were appropriate responses to challenging classroom situations and were within accepted educational practices." The victim blaming had begun. As Joanne had expected, Mrs. Peterson's defense would attempt to paint the abused children as behavioral problems who had driven a dedicated teacher to desperate measures. It was a strategy that might resonate with jurors who had their own frustrations with children's behavior, or who preferred to believe that systematic abuse was impossible in institutions they trusted. But they had evidence now documentation, recordings, and witness testimony that revealed the calculated nature of the abuse and the institutional conspiracy that had protected it. The battle ahead would be difficult and painful, but Joanne Williams had never been more ready for a fight that mattered. The courtroom felt smaller than Joanne had expected, though she'd never been inside one before, except in movies and television shows. The reality was more mundane and intimidating simultaneously. Fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows, wooden benches that reminded her of church pews, and an atmosphere heavy with the weight of institutional judgment. She sat in the front row of the gallery, close enough to see the tension in Ada Martinez's shoulders as she prepared for opening arguments. Margaret Peterson sat at the defense table wearing a conservative navy suit that made her look more like a concerned parent than an accused child abuser. Her grey hair was styled professionally, and she maintained the composed demeanor of someone accustomed to commanding classroom attention. The transformation was jarring. Gone was any trace of the authority figure who had systematically terrorized vulnerable children, replaced by a defendant who projected respectability and wounded dignity. Your Honor, the prosecution will prove that Margaret Peterson engaged in systematic physical and psychological abuse of children entrusted to her care. Ada Martinez began, her voice carrying the controlled passion that Joanne had come to associate. With righteous advocacy, we will show that this abuse was not the result of momentary lapses in judgment, but rather a calculated pattern of violence designed to control students through fear and intimidation. The opening statement laid out the case methodically. Multiple victims across several years, documented injuries consistent with repeated ruler strikes, audio recordings of Mrs. Peterson coaching co-conspirators on defense strategies, and evidence of administrative knowledge and cover-up. Each element built upon the others to create a picture of institutional corruption that extended far beyond one teacher's individual crimes. Defense attorney Michael Harrison rose for his opening with the confidence of someone who had built his career defending the supposedly defensible. He was younger than Joanne had expected, with the kind of aggressive energy that suggested he viewed this case as a career-making opportunity rather than a tragic failure of institutional trust. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will hear testimony from children who have been coached by angry parents to exaggerate normal disciplinary interactions. He began, his tone suggesting reasonable doubt while subtly attacking the victims and their families. You will hear from adults who have transformed minor classroom management issues into criminal allegations because they refuse to accept that their children might occasionally misbehave in school. The victim blaming felt like a physical assault on Joanne's composure. Harrison's strategy was exactly what she had feared. Paint the abused children as liars and their protective parents as vindictive manipulators seeking attention or financial gain. It was a defense that might resonate with jurors who preferred to believe that systematic child abuse was impossible in institutions they trusted. Mrs. Peterson is a dedicated educator who spent 15 years serving this community's children, Harrison continued, gesturing toward his client with practiced sympathy. She used time-honored disciplinary techniques that helped countless students learn self-control and respect for authority. The prosecution would have you criminalize the very foundations of classroom management because some parents refuse to accept that effective discipline sometimes requires firm measures. The phrase time-honored disciplinary techniques made Joanne's hands clench involuntarily. Harrison was attempting to normalize child abuse by wrapping it in traditional educational language, suggesting that opposition to systematic violence represented modern permissiveness rather than basic human decency. Ada Martinez's first witness was Dr. Sarah Martinez, who took the stand with the professional composure Joanne remembered from their years of collaboration. Her testimony was clinical and devastating, detailed documentation of injuries that could only have resulted from repeated physical assault, medical evidence that contradicted claims of accidental contact, and expert opinion about the psychological trauma associated with systematic abuse by trusted authority figures. The pattern of injuries I documented on these children is consistent with deliberate strikes using a rigid implement, such as a wooden ruler. Dr. Martinez testified, her voice steady despite the horrific nature of her evidence. The force required to leave such marks indicates intentional violence rather than accidental contact or minor disciplinary correction. Harrison's cross-examination was aggressive but ultimately ineffective. He attempted to suggest that the injuries could have resulted from playground accidents or home-based trauma, but Dr. Martinez's expertise and documentation were too thorough to be undermined by hypothetical alternative explanations. Doctor, isn't it true that children often fabricate stories about injuries to avoid taking responsibility for their own actions? Harrison asked, his tone carrying implication that went beyond the specific medical evidence. In my 15 years of pediatric practice, I have found children to be remarkably honest about how they sustained injuries, particularly when those injuries result from adult violence, Dr. Martinez replied with calm authority. The pattern of trauma I observed in these cases is entirely consistent with the children's accounts and inconsistent with alternative explanations. The morning session concluded with Detective Santos taking the stand to introduce the physical evidence that had been recovered during the search warrants. Joanne watched the jury's faces as photographs of Mrs. Peterson's discipline area were displayed. The converted supply closet with impact marks on the walls, the collection of broken rulers, the leather-bound notebook filled with victim profiles, and abuse documentation. The evidence was overwhelming, but Joanne understood that criminal cases could turn on factors beyond simple facts. Jury sympathy, institutional credibility, and cultural attitudes toward childhood discipline would all play roles in determining whether justice would be served or whether Mrs. Peterson would return to a position where she could harm other children. Amara took the witness stand on the third day of testimony, her small frame dwarfed by the elevated chair designed for adults. The court had made accommodations for her age, a booster seat to help her reach the microphone, permission for Joanne to remain visible in her line of sight, and the presence of a victim advocate trained in child psychology. But no accommodation could fully address the fundamental injustice of requiring an 8-year-old to publicly relive her trauma in service of adult justice. She wore her favorite purple dress with small flowers, the same one she'd chosen for the CPS interview weeks earlier. Her dark hair was pulled back with a headband that had tiny butterflies embroidered along its edge, a detail that made her look even younger and more vulnerable under the courtroom's harsh lighting. ADA Martinez approached the witness stand with the gentle authority of someone accustomed to coaxing truth from frightened children. Her questions were carefully structured to help Amara tell her story, without overwhelming her with legal complexity or traumatic details. Amara, can you tell the jury about your teacher, Mrs. Peterson? She began, her voice pitched at the conversational level that might be used during a friendly chat rather than formal testimony. She was my teacher in 3rd grade, Amara replied, her voice small but clear through the courtroom's sound system. She taught us math and reading and science. Did you like being in Mrs. Peterson's class? Amara's pause was brief but telling. Sometimes, but sometimes she got angry with kids who talked or moved around too much. What happened when Mrs. Peterson got angry? She would make kids come up to her desk and hold out their arms. Then she would hit them with the ruler. The words came out in a rush, as if Amara was afraid she might lose courage if she spoke more slowly. Did this happen to you? Yes, multiple times. Ada Martinez guided Amara through the specific incidents she remembered. The math lesson when she'd whispered to Sarah about a problem she didn't understand. The reading circle when she'd fidgeted during story time, the art project when she'd accidentally knocked over a jar of paint water. Each memory was accompanied by detailed recollection of the physical pain and emotional humiliation that followed. "Did Mrs. Peterson say anything to you after she used the ruler?" Ada Martinez asked. "She said it would help me remember to follow classroom rules. And she said not to tell anyone, because parents wouldn't understand that teachers sometimes have to use strong discipline." The manipulation embedded in Mrs. Peterson's words became even more chilling when delivered in Amara's innocent voice. The courtroom was absolutely silent as the 8-year-old described being systematically isolated from potential sources of help and protection. Defense attorney Harrison's cross-examination was a masterpiece of barely controlled aggression disguised as gentle questioning. He attempted to suggest that Amara's memories might be confused or influenced by adult coaching, that her perception of events might be colored by her desire to avoid responsibility for classroom disruptions. "Amara, sometimes when we get in trouble, we might remember things differently than they actually happened," he said, his tone patronizing in its false kindness. "Is it possible that Mrs. Peterson was just trying to help you learn better behavior? She hit me with a ruler hard enough to leave marks," Amara replied with stunning directness. "That's not helping. That's hurting." The simplicity of her response cut through Harrison's complex legal maneuvering with devastating effectiveness. An 8-year-old's understanding of the difference between help and harm was clearer and more honest than any adult rationalization about educational discipline. "But you were disrupting the class, weren't you?" Harrison pressed, attempting to establish that Amara bore some responsibility for the violence inflicted upon her. "I was talking to Sarah about math because I didn't understand the problem," Amara said, tears beginning to form in her dark eyes. "Talking isn't bad. Hitting is bad." Ada Martinez's redirect was brief but powerful, allowing Amara to clarify that she had never been violent toward other students or teachers, that her classroom infractions consisted entirely of age-appropriate behaviors like talking, fidgeting, and asking questions. The contrast between her minor childhood actions and the systematic violence used to punish them became starkly apparent to everyone present. When Amara stepped down from the witness stand, Joanne felt simultaneously proud of her daughter's courage and heartbroken that such courage had been necessary. The 8-year-old had faced down aggressive questioning from a professional attorney while describing traumatic experiences that would challenge many adults. The prosecution's case concluded with Eleanor Vasquez's testimony about the evidence. She had documented over years of silent observation. Her recordings of Mrs. Peterson coaching co-conspirators played through the courtroom's sound system, revealing the calculated nature of both the original abuse and the subsequent cover-up. Attempts. "I knew it was wrong," Mrs. Vasquez testified, her accented English carrying the weight of moral clarity. "I saw the broken rulers. I heard the children crying. I witnessed the systematic preparation for violence disguised as education. I should have spoken up sooner, but I was afraid of losing my job. That fear doesn't excuse my silence, but it explains why institutional abuse can continue for years when good people choose self-protection over child welfare." Her testimony provided the missing piece of institutional accountability. The witness who could document systematic patterns of abuse while explaining how fear and economic vulnerability created conditions for continued silence among potential protectors. As the prosecution rested its case, Joanne looked across the courtroom at Mrs. Peterson, who maintained her composed demeanor despite the overwhelming evidence of her crimes. Tomorrow would bring the defense's attempt to normalize child abuse through claims of educational necessity and victim responsibility. But today belonged to truth, courage, and the hope that justice might finally be within reach. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Joanne spent those 48 hours in a state of controlled anxiety, alternating between confidence in the strength of their evidence and fear that institutional credibility might somehow override documented child abuse. She cleaned her apartment twice, organized Amara's school supplies for the third time, and found herself staring at the kitchen table where this nightmare had begun 6 months earlier. When the call finally came from Ada Martinez, Joanne's hands trembled as she answered the phone. "We have a verdict," Martinez said simply. "Guilty on all counts." The words felt surreal, as if they belonged to someone else's story rather than the battle she had fought since discovering those angry red welts on her daughter's arms. Margaret Peterson had been convicted of aggravated child abuse, conspiracy to commit child abuse, and failure to report suspected abuse in her capacity as a mandatory reporter. The jury had seen through the defense's victim-blaming strategy and recognized systematic violence for what it truly was. Principal Morrison and 2 other administrators were convicted on lesser charges related to failure to report and administrative negligence. The custodian's recordings had provided crucial evidence of institutional knowledge and deliberate indifference that extended the conspiracy beyond Mrs. Peterson's individual crimes. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later in the same courtroom where Amara had demonstrated such remarkable courage. Mrs. Peterson received 8 years in prison, a sentence that felt both significant and inadequate given the scope of harm she had inflicted on vulnerable children over multiple years. The administrative defendants received shorter sentences and permanent bans from educational employment, consequences that ended their careers, but seemed insufficient given their role in enabling systematic abuse. More important than individual punishment was the systemic change that emerged from the case's resolution. The school district agreed to a comprehensive settlement that included financial compensation for affected families, mandatory installation of surveillance systems in all classrooms, and implementation of trauma-informed educational practices throughout the system. New policies required multiple staff members to witness any physical contact with students, and anonymous reporting systems were established to encourage disclosure of inappropriate disciplinary practices. Mrs. Rodriguez, Amara's new teacher, had become more than just an educator. She was a healing presence who understood that rebuilding trust required patience, consistency, and recognition that some wounds took longer to heal than others. Under her guidance, Amara gradually rediscovered the joy of learning without fear, though the hypervigilance born of betrayed trust would probably never completely disappear. "How are you feeling about everything that happened?" Joanne asked her. Daughter one evening as they prepared dinner together in their kitchen, the same space where truth had first been spoken and justice had begun its slow journey toward resolution. "I'm glad Mrs. Peterson can't hurt other kids anymore," Amara replied, stirring pasta sauce with careful concentration. "But I'm sad that it happened at all." The wisdom in her 8-year-old response captured something that all the legal proceedings and institutional reforms couldn't fully address: the irreducible sadness of innocence lost and trust broken. Justice had been served, but healing remained, an ongoing process that would extend far beyond courtroom verdicts and policy changes. Joanne had returned to her nursing duties at Children's Memorial, but the experience had changed her professional perspective in subtle but profound ways. She found herself more attentive to signs of institutional abuse among her young patients, more willing to challenge authority figures who prioritize convenience over child welfare, and more skilled at recognizing the complex trauma that resulted from systematic betrayal by trusted adults. The other families from Mrs. Peterson's classroom had begun to heal as well, though each child's journey was unique. Some recovered quickly once the source of their fear was removed. Others required extensive counseling to address the psychological damage caused by months or years of systematic intimidation. the parent support group that had emerged during. The crisis continued to meet monthly, offering ongoing connection for families who understood each other's experiences in ways that outsiders never could. Eleanor Vasquez had kept her custodial position and had become something of a hero among parents who understood that her courage in coming forward had made justice possible. The district had implemented new policies protecting whistleblowers, though Joanne remained skeptical about whether institutional cultures could truly change without ongoing vigilance from those they claimed to serve. 6 months after the sentencing, Joanne received a letter from a mother in another district whose child had disclosed similar abuse by a different teacher. The woman had read about their case in the newspaper and was seeking advice about how to navigate institutional resistance and advocate effectively for her son's protection. The letter reminded Joanne that their victory was both complete and incomplete. Justice had been achieved in their specific case, but the underlying conditions that enabled institutional child abuse continued to exist in schools across the country. She spent an evening drafting a detailed response that included contact information for experienced attorneys, guidance about evidence gathering, and encouragement about the possibility of holding institutional power accountable for its failures. The letter felt like a continuation of the fight she had never wanted to begin, but could never fully abandon. As autumn arrived and Amara began 4th grade in Mrs. Rodriguez's classroom, Joanne reflected on how much their lives had changed since that morning when she had discovered evidence of systematic abuse disguised as education. They had survived institutional betrayal, legal proceedings, media attention, and the complex process of seeking justice in systems designed to protect those in power. Most importantly, they had preserved their relationship and their family's foundation of trust and mutual protection. Amara continued to confide in her mother about both ordinary childhood concerns and the lingering effects of trauma. Joanne continued to advocate fiercely for her daughter's welfare, while respecting her growing independence and resilience. The red welts had healed completely, leaving no physical trace of the violence that had shattered their trust in institutional safety. But the lessons learned about courage, truth-telling, and the necessity of fighting for those who cannot protect themselves would remain with them always. Some battles choose us rather than the reverse. When they do, the only acceptable response is to fight with everything we possess until justice is achieved and the vulnerable are protected from those who would exploit their trust.